I am deeply grateful that she has agreed to join us and speak with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Naila Nasir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I mean, we are in a hockey arena. I'm going to need some energy from you all this afternoon. I am incredibly honored to be sharing this very special moment with you all, the graduates who have worked so incredibly hard to be sitting here, and the parents, family members, friends, spouses who have sacrificed in all kinds of ways. I've always loved graduations. Right? They're this moment of possibility, of hope, of having fought through the struggles, and of looking to the future. So for the time I have with you this afternoon, I thought I'd share some thoughts about our job as scholars of education and as educators, and on what I believe the world needs from us as a field at this critical juncture. And I want to make clear that I stand in front of you speaking from my own positionality this afternoon, as a Black woman of a certain age, as the parent of 4 children, as the daughter of a landscaper and a legal secretary, as a scholar of race and education, and as the former vice chancellor of equity and inclusion, where I witnessed how race and class and disability status and immigration status and sexual identity mattered for the experiences students were having at my university, for the extent to which they felt at home there, and for the extent to which they were served well educationally. And as the current foundation president who sees it as my calling to help make the world better, more whole, more humane, more kind through the funding of research that improves education. And so it won't be a surprise to you, especially given Kathy's great intro, that I'm going to focus much of my comments on what I think is one of the most pressing challenges of education today, and that is educational inequality. I kind of want to apologize in advance for that. It's not the most lighthearted topic, but I will use this as an example of when you have a calling, you share in that calling, even when it's a tiny bit uncomfortable. What we know is that in every aspect of education, access to well-trained teachers, high-quality curriculum, adequately resourced buildings, graduation rates, access to technology, and standardized test scores, there are vast differences by race and social class. Gloria Ladson-Billings has referred to this as the education debt, to signal the debt our country owes marginalized groups around the educational opportunities that were denied to them. But before I get any more deeply into the direct conversation about education, I want to open with a couple of personal stories, both of which illustrate a principle I think we can apply to thinking about educational inequality and the importance of not just understanding current inequalities, but contextualizing them within an historical perspective. So the first story is about my family. Sometime around November 2016, I was upset about some recent national events, unable to face the world, when I found the perfect distraction, Ancestry.com. I don't know if you all have used this, but it is amazing. I've always been interested in family history, but had never taken the time to sit and actually do a family tree. So given that I had all this time on my hands and a reality to avoid, I started in. And those of you who use this site know that the way that it works is you put in the information names, birth dates, birthplaces, and it starts to kind of populate itself, and it pops up suggestions, and you can see birth certificates and census records and death certificates and immigration paperwork. And so 2 days and very little showering or sleeping later, there I was, staring at my family tree on both sides as far back as I could go. Now, I'm biracial, so I was able to trace the Black side of my family back to the first generation born out of slavery, right? You can't go back further than that because there aren't birth certificates. And I was able to trace the white side of my family clear back to the Mayflower. And so that was a really long setup to tell you this one thing. So when I stepped back and looked at the occupations of my relatives over all of these generations, it had never been so clear to me the costs of segregation and systematic racism in this country. For generations on the black side of my family, there were laundresses and housekeepers and nannies and carpenters and farmhands and general laborers. Well, on the white side, you see kind of the full range of professions, right? Reverends and rabbis and artists and doctors and chemists and lawyers and business people, and certainly some farmhands and secretaries and laborers there too, but not for generations and not systematically. And I thought about those black ancestors of mine, no less brilliant of mind and spirit than me, right? I was able to get a PhD, write books, lead this amazing foundation, who took all of that brilliance and potential and went to substandard segregated schools and washed other people's laundry for generations. The second story builds on the first. It's not about family trees, it is about whiskey. Yeah, now you're with me. So last summer, I got a frantic call from a very dear friend, an avid whiskey drinker, who had read a recent story in the New York Times about Jack Daniel's whiskey. And the story had put him in a bind. The Jack Daniel's company was renovating its visitor center, right? And in doing so, they happened upon some previously lost records. So for many years, the visitor center had been telling the story that the secret to Jack Daniel's whiskey was this recipe that Jack created. And kind of, he built this company around this really original recipe for whiskey. But it turns out this new information that they found showed that the recipe was not Jack's at all. The recipe belonged to a slave that Jack owned. And so not only was the recipe of this slave, the descendants of this original slave worked for the Jack Daniel's company for generations, lending their expertise to this endeavor. And my friend's dilemma was about whether he could still drink the whiskey, knowing that it was built on the backs of slaves who themselves nor their descendants were able to reap any of the benefit of the profits of their labor. And so for me, both of these stories illustrate that racial inequality, along with gender inequality and many other forms of exclusion that are a part of our national and global history, obviously existed sometime in the past, like in the way back past. But they also carry forward to the present in tangible and consequential ways. And so in the two stories, the past inequalities that carry into the present have to do with social mobility and finances and the ability to reap the financial rewards of one's labor. But similarly, the current state of inequality in education can't be understood without facing the really hard things about our past with respect to the atrocities to humanity and the denials of opportunity we have committed in our society and in education. I promise you, it's going to get more positive as I go. Just stick with me a little while longer. Our national educational past involves not only the undereducation of black children through Jim Crow laws and the practices of segregation, but also Native American children taken from their families and forced to be educated in boarding schools as a form of cultural assimilation, the undereducation of girls, and extreme gender discrimination in higher education, in higher education and in the workforce, which up until really about the 1970s meant that women's brilliance and intellectual capacity was to be devoted to the domestic sphere and to support men in building careers. Y'all watch Mad Men? I mean, if you haven't, it's worth a look. The persecution and exclusion of folks who identified as LGBTQ, the extreme exclusion of people with disabilities and mental illness, warehousing them in facilities where abuse and cruelty were common and where their educational potential was left undeveloped. Right? Anti-Semitic and anti-immigration sentiments in schools at the turn of the century, English-only policy in schools, stripping immigrants of their home languages and cultures in efforts to assimilate them. So there's like a lot. Right? And that past, that complicated past carries forward into our present to maintain an unequal playing field, unearned advantage, undeserved disadvantage, and intergenerational trauma for both the marginalized and the privileged, because it takes a lot to hold on to privilege. So what does any of this have to do with education, and why are we having such a depressing conversation at graduation? Education in this country is a complicated thing, and our current education system is facing many challenges that we need to attend to and remedy, rooted in these long-standing patterns of exploitation, underdevelopment, and inequality. And if we are to achieve the goal of providing high-quality education to all children and young people, then our task is not to run from the challenges, not to run from the truth, not to run from the depressing parts, but to unearth them and take them up courageously. And so I want to talk about 3 current challenges in education today. I'll do so pretty quickly, with an eye towards what we need to do to be prepared as we go out into the world to improve education as educators and as scholars. The first challenge is divestment in education as a public good. So this kind of has hit me recently as I listened to the discourse about education. So as a society, both with respect to our investments and with respect to the way we talk about education, the very nature of how we think and talk about public education has shifted. At its best, a system of public schooling is not just about educating children. It's about creating a well-educated, thoughtful, critically engaged populace, right? Philosophers of education write about public schooling as a key element of our democracy, because it is through the pedagogies, practices, and curricula in school that young people learn how to be citizens. They prepare to be engaged voters, parents, and lawmakers, and to participate in the democratic process. However, over the last decade, or perhaps even longer, the idea of public schools, the frame we use to understand schooling, has been shifting. Public schools have moved from being considered a public good, existing for the good of society as a whole, to being thought of and discussed as a private good, something families can use to get into college and achieve access to resources and wealth. This is an alarming shift because it means that our decisions about education lose their center, which should be how we improve the whole of society through our system of education, and it becomes about how individuals and families use education and access to retain or gain privilege. And it's not just a philosophy that's shifted. There's been a decline in funding streams from federal, state, and local sources in many parts of the country. Multiple reports show that spending on public education has not only been declining over the last decade, but that it will continue to do so. Even more troubling, higher education institutions have made up budget shortfalls by raising tuition, impacting access. This has caused alarming increases in housing and food insecurity among students living out of their cars and skipping meals. And so it occurs to me that we, as education scholars and as educators, don't have a clear vision for what a transformative system of public education looks like, one that would support us as a society to create the kind of world where we give birth to new structures that truly serve and foster the development of human potential for all people. My point here is that we cannot create anything that we cannot envision. And so when I think about the scholarship and the work that is needed in education, a new vision rooted in a space of possibility is really essential. The second challenge I want to discuss is the resegregation of schools. Gary Orfield has written extensively about resegregation patterns in schools. The short of it is that we all know that formal desegregation in this country happened after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, right? However, less known is that in about 1990, the progress made after Brown started to be reversed. And some have argued that schools in this country are more segregated now than they were when the Brown decision was handed down. Most agree that the level of inequality in our schools will be detrimental for the future of this nation. It is perhaps worthwhile to note that school segregation is made possible by extreme residential segregation in this country, which was created by policies and practices around housing. I think there's a silver lining there, because if segregation was created by laws and policies, it can be uncreated by laws and policies as well. It is not a given. The third challenge I want to talk about is reductive measures of learning. And the gist of it is this. Since the introduction of No Child Left Behind in the early 1990s, we have been in an era of attempts to measure learning to hold schools and teachers accountable. Great intentions here. George Bush, who apparently was a graduation speaker here a few years back, said that one of the goals of No Child Left Behind was to root out, quote, the soft bigotry of low expectations. And indeed, core to NCLB policies was to compare learning outcomes across subgroups to ensure everyone had equal opportunity. Unfortunately, it was a little like that story about the guy who's looking for his keys under the lamppost, not because that's where he lost them, but because that's where the light is shining, right? We ended up measuring learning not in terms of what we thought was most important to measure, but rather what we could measure easily and economically with standardized tests. The problem here is twofold. First, the measures themselves didn't tell us very much about whether or not schools were providing the rich learning opportunities for learners, whether they were teaching critical thinking skills and higher order problem solving skills. They reduced learning to facts and formulas, and then went so far as to pay teachers based on student test scores or to sanction whole schools based on the scores of their students. This had many perverse effects that are well documented. Teachers changing practices, teaching to the test, whole schools working to game the system, and the poor performing students being pushed out or being told to stay home on test day. And what we need to figure out is how to measure, reward, and grow the kinds of learning we know intuitively and by research is what all kids should have access to. Learning that sets their curiosity on fire. Learning that engages the kind of critical thinking and problem solving we need future generations to have to solve the major crises of our society, homelessness and global warming. So for me, the work of education, of improving public systems of education, is inherently about creating the kind of society we want to have. One which aligns with our values of supporting the full potential of young people, of providing opportunity regardless of the resources of the family or community you happen to be born into. The work is to disrupt these past inequalities, because otherwise our work in education becomes about giving more resources to those who have already been historically privileged, right? And this runs counter to the entire project of public education and against the very core of our democracy. And so, graduates, after you walk across the stage this afternoon, and after you celebrate with your loved ones, which may or may not involve Jack Daniel's whiskey, I encourage you to use the full power of your education and your brilliance to build something that matters to education. We learn in our field to critique, right? And critique is really important, but I also challenge you to build something that affirms humanity, that disrupts long-standing inequalities, that develops people, that heals, that creates educational opportunity that is richer, steeped in the richness and beauty of what learning should be. That is our responsibility as the educated and as the open-hearted and as those stewarding the future of our nation. Thank you. And so I challenge you to stay committed, to find and stay in that space of purpose, to find and cultivate working from a space of possibility, radical possibility, to take up large, complex, perhaps messy, but critically important problems of education and of society, and to see yourselves as key to solving those problems, not just observing or documenting them. I challenge you to look at inequalities squarely in the face, to acknowledge their long-standing historical antecedents rooted in hate and dehumanization, and to commit to doing your part to creating structures and opportunities and educational spaces of love that disrupt inequality and create new possibility. And with that, I congratulate you and look forward to seeing all the amazing work you will do in the world.